Well, thanks again for joining, folks, and joining the increasing numbers who are tuning into Stockwell day-to-day news. Appreciate that, and appreciate the comments. Let me know what you think. Give me some ideas on going forward. We're looking today at some pretty amazing stories here, stories that are to do with incidents that are carrying on around the world. A lot of it is based on emotion, so we want to look at some hard facts, and then let's combine our emotions and see what we can come up with right now. In Canada, especially for those of you who are watching from the US, there's a real war going on in terms of how we actually define ourselves, how Canadians define themselves in terms of relationships with the United States. And this has all come to a focal point with the Premier of Ontario, and he has taken out an ad, which you've probably heard about, played it in the U.S. That's caused lots of controversy. The Reagan Foundation in the U.S. is threatening to sue the government of Ontario for putting out an ad that they say is fraudulent about Ronald Reagan and things he said. It's really just exploding all over the place here. And so the government of Ontario said, okay, we'll back off on the ad. That got the President Trump was mad when he saw the ad and canceled all discussions with Canada. And the Premier Ford and the government of Ontario decided, we're going to add that, let that ad run one or two more times. So they've been running it on the World Series. That has caused a reaction on the U.S. They came back and said, not only we're not going to talk to you anymore, we're going to hit you with an extra 10%. So, folks, things are kind of running a little wild as emotions run high. And as a bit of a metaphor, look at the World Series that's going on right now. We've got Toronto, the Blue Jays, and they're fighting it out, duking it out with the L.A. Dodgers. Amazing games that are going on here. And a lot of that is defined not just by the love of the sport and good competition and watching these athletes, but a lot of that is descending into some pretty raw and basic emotion. You've got Canadian fans that are booing, and they're putting up signs about Ohtani and the fact he wouldn't come to Canada. And in the U.S., in the previous series with Boston, you had the Boston fans booing Canadians just on rivalries based on nationalism, really not based on love of the sport. Let's keep in mind that on both sides, the players, they are multi-million-dollar private business people, which I don't begrudge at all. They're making huge money. They will immediately go to another city and play there if they're offered more money. So let's just enjoy the game, these great athletes, and keep in mind some of the things that are driving this. Let's enjoy things and not be prepared to almost like start another war between us. Remember, there was a war in 1814. I remind my American friends that north of the border, we came down there, we burned down the White House, you burned down one of our buildings, and we haven't really got into a big fight since then, except for now with these trade wars. So, folks, calm down. Let's look at facts. Let's deal with results, and let's get away from this other stuff, and let's enjoy the game, enjoy the series. The strategy, apparently, and Premier Ford in Ontario has said this, they said, what's your strategy behind it? People are suggesting two things. First of all, because so many Canadians can be so easily triggered by feelings about the U.S., there is the thought that Premier Ford is using that, just not worried about what the trade implications are going to be or how it's going to hurt our economy, but he knows it will just gain votes just by standing up and shaking an angry fist at the U.S. The other thinking is that, and this is why they said they did the ad, they feel the ad in Ontario, the government there feels the ad is actually going to affect the thinking of the Supreme Court justices in the U.S., and that they will, because they've got an upcoming ruling here that will decide a lot along the ability, justification of a president, this being the U.S., to actually launch a lot of these tariffs. So that's coming up to the Supreme Court. They're considering it now. I think it's a bit naive of Canadians. We get this vaunted view of ourselves that the Supreme Court justices are sitting around glued to their TVs saying, wow, what do the Canadians think about this? The Supreme Court judges are not doing that, I can tell you. My feeling is, this is my gut, and I could be wrong, it's not a prediction, I think they're going to come out, the Supreme Court justice, with a ruling that's not going to be altogether positive towards Trump and the tariffs and when he's allowed to use them. If that does happen, watch for the government of Ontario. They will take the credit for it. They will say that their ad convinced all those Supreme Court justices. It's created a huge problem. I do know that. And people on both sides who are level-headed are saying, can we just negotiate, get into some hard negotiations? Everything, or a lot of what Canada has been doing has been just to shake the fist at the U.S. We talk about elbows up. Elbows up is fine, but not if it means brains down. And so many of the comments that have come from the Canadian side, whether it's the Prime Minister, who, by the way, is now saying that that ad was a dumb idea, or whether it's coming from the provinces or the media, let's calm down. Let's look at the relationship. Could be one of the greatest relationships in modern history between these two countries. There are countries, almost every country around the world would just give anything to be the neighbor to the U.S. Let's work on the positives of that. Let's get down to some hard discussions and negotiations and lower the emotional quotient on these. It's really important on the political side, as decisions are being made and as decisions are going to be made by voters related to who's going to govern, that we look at things not emotionally. Sure, we're going to be moved and we're going to have our feelings about people, but can we get back to a discussion, let's say, on the economic issues? Let's have hard discussions and look historically. Do socialist economic principles lead to a flourishing economy, or don't they? My view of history is that socialist principles, left-leaning economic principles, do not lead to a flourishing of society. But let's have those debates. Let's not collapse into just calling each side evil and thinking of all different ways to embarrass them. We've got to talk about these things because they hugely impact our financial future, which will affect so much of the rest of our future. Even on social issues, can we not discuss these social issues, look to facts, at least as far as possible? You know, the gender issue just gets people inflamed on both sides. Can we not get down to the centrality of the issue? You have some governments that are saying, or most governments are saying, and in Alberta, the province of Alberta, the premier there is Danielle Smith, and what she has said on this issue, she said, listen, adults have the right to make decisions about their own bodies and whether they want to alter their bodies either physically, chemically, or surgically, but it's not going to be happening with kids. Kids will be treated respectfully, but we don't want them entering into these procedures before they've even matured, either physically through puberty or emotionally and socially. And so there's been a guideline put in place that none of these procedures are going to be happening without until the child becomes an adult and with the involvement of parents. These are just sound reasoning, basic policies. Can we not keep it at that and not descend into the name calling that goes along with whatever the issue is? Folks, we need to focus. These are big issues. Let's respect one another and have good debates. In Canada, and for our American friends, you may be kind of scratching your head and wondering, you keep hearing about, if you're following Canadian news, the use of something called the notwithstanding clause. The notwithstanding clause. And if you look at headlines in Canadian media, you would think this is some kind of nuclear option that governments could use that would in fact cause for pretty well close to the collapse of civilization if it's used. Now, let's take the quick history on this. It was over 40 years ago. Almost 45 years ago, the Prime Minister of the day, the senior Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, was wanting to bring in his own brand of Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so they brought in a Charter of Rights, and provinces were really worried, especially in the West, that this is going to take away the autonomy that's in our Constitution for provinces. And it looked like the whole thing was going to come unglued. And then it was a socialist premier, NDP premier from the province of Saskatchewan, Premier Blakeney, who worked with and endorsed this idea that Prime Minister Trudeau brought forward, saying, look, if you provinces are worried that the federal government is going to come out with something so horrific that you can't live with it, let's allow for a notwithstanding clause that would say if the courts ruled in certain areas, and this is only certain areas, it does not affect things like inalienable rights, like the rights of people that are based on race, that are based on gender, that are seen as core to our freedoms. But it's to do with other areas, and they're all defined in the Constitution. So what the Prime Minister said was, look, if there is a federal court ruling and you think it takes away from your provincial rights in such a way that you just can't live with it, you're going to be able to use a notwithstanding clause, which says basically the province is then saying, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court has said, we're going to put this particular item on hold for a maximum of 5 years, and then it basically comes into play. So it's asking for breathing time. It's saying, let's put this on pause. That's what it is. And whenever a premier talks about using the notwithstanding clause, the mainstream media really just, they light their hair on fire and go completely berserk and say, this is just a nuclear option. It's going to be the end of civilization as we know it. No, it's just a hold. It's saying, let's hold on. You want to keep the provinces together? Let's watch and see how this plays out. That's what the intention was. So the socialist premier from the NDP province, Blakeney, along with another premier of Manitoba, his name was Sterling Lyon, and then really championing this thought was former Premier Peter Lougheed in Alberta, and they all agreed to it. Other than Quebec, that's another story. And so the hope for what Prime Minister Trudeau was hoping for in his charter actually came into being with the notwithstanding clause. It's been used a number of times. It's been quoted. It's been cited a number of times across the country. Canada has not exploded. Canada has not disappeared. It's still there. So now what we've got is a situation in Alberta where the teachers are on strike, and they're taking to court the ability of the government to, guess what, allow for choice in what? Education. Choice in education. What a concept. Choice in anything in a marketplace always leads to a better product, because when you have healthy competition, you have both sides trying to improve what they're doing. And this particular ability in Alberta, actually in any province, to allow parents true diversity. I mean, the left say that they want diversity, but if it comes up with an idea that maybe isn't to their liking or within their worldview, they don't like it so much. And so they're even wanting a recall on the Minister of Education, whose job it is to run the education system. They're trying to get a referendum going to get parents across the province infused in anger against other parents who make choices. And this is at a time where parents are making choices, especially post-COVID, in terms of different forms of education. And it's really all coming to a head with the Premier of Alberta saying, well, we may bring in the notwithstanding clause if a court ever says that parents don't have the right to choice in education. I'm saying, folks, stay calm. These are good and important subjects. Let's talk about them. And let's remember, even Prime Minister Trudeau today, and helping him author that so-called notwithstanding clause was one of his senior ministers at the time, a man by the name of Jean Chrétien, who went on later to become prime minister and who I went head-to-head with in one federal election. And both of them said, you know, we don't really love this clause, but it's the glue that'll keep the country together by having that kind of a safety clause, a safety valve in place. Let's look at it through the eyes of the originators of the document, the Charter of Rights and Freedom, and that they found a way to compromise and move the country ahead. Prime Minister Carney is traveling the world, one shot after another of him, going to this country and that country, and he's saying he's promoting trade so that we can break away from our reliance on the U.S. Look, I was Minister of International Trade, and I went around the country at the behest of our Prime Minister, signing free trade deals. I see Prime Minister Carney, for instance, going to South Korea with much fanfare. I hope he looks at the documents that are there. He'll see the free trade deal that we acquired with South Korea. This is way back. This is about 2008 or 2009. And he'll see that a lot of this has happened. I might say to him, with the problems that are brewing at home, Prime Minister, we need you here. You have ministers. This is why you send ministers out to negotiate these deals. We have many free trade deals already in place with the Asian and South Asian countries. Let's rely on those. Let's rely on ministers. Let's focus on the problems right now at home because they're coming to a head. Could be that the budget won't be passed in the House of Commons. That would force an election. So I'm encouraging people on both sides, speak up, talk about what the issues are, and let Canadians decide on this. These are important issues. Let's have an intelligent, calm conversation on the fact that what will happen if the budget produces a deficit that's getting larger and larger, that requires more and more taxes. Some of us are of the view that the small L liberal approach to budgeting and spending and financing taxes and debt is wrong, that countries and nations and cities cannot flourish if they become increasingly burdened with debt and taxes. Let's have that debate. Let's keep the emotions out of it and have the debate that is needed. When you look at political drift, very interesting to see, and we're going back to the province of Ontario now, they've just announced that they are going to drop their previous approach and acceptance of something called fixed date elections. Fixed date elections. These are common in the United States and around the world, but Canada has always given flexibility to the legislatures and to the federal government to kind of choose, as long as you have an election every 5 years, this is within our Constitution, you can surprise people. If you're the premier, for instance, or if you're the prime minister, you can surprise people and call a quick elections. And premiers and prime ministers have done this in the past. They can see at a time where they're kind of running a little bit positively in the polls, they'll call for the snap election. That's really an abuse of democracy. It's really a matter of, run up your election before you call it by announcing all kinds of gifts that you're going to give to people and to provinces and move up in the polls and call the election. And it was really encouraging in the past to see Ontario and to see Alberta leading in this charge, actually, British Columbia, having fixed date elections. You can do it within our Constitution. You just say that, in the time of an emergency or whenever you want to call it. But other than that, elections will be on a fixed date. So when you just have an election, you'll know what date about 4 or 5 years later is going to be the next one. Moving away from this is a sign of a government that is grasping for power, that wants to have every upper hand that it can over the citizens. Not a positive thing. Government Ontario is also moving towards increasing and embracing in an even stronger way this whole notion of governments funding and subsidizing political parties, when it should be political parties. It should be the citizens who fund their parties of their choice. If I want to fund or to see a conservative party funded, I shouldn't be going to the government and saying, I want you to tax my neighbor to fund the political party that I like. No, I should be going out there and raising those funds. So the argument, it always comes, and it comes from the left, comes from the socialists, who always have a harder time raising money. They're saying we shouldn't take big money. We shouldn't have this coming in. We should actually have a system where government subsidizes political parties. And when you look at it, in those cases, the government will decide which political parties. There have to be things happen to qualify for it. So not a good sign that we are moving away from citizen choice to government imposition. Combine that with moving away from set date elections, fixed date elections. I'm a little bit concerned about what we're seeing out of the province of Ontario, a conservative government that does a lot of good things, but I think they could be straying from the course here. Let's take a look and watch what is going to happen there. Another good sign of where these debates, where they're so important, and we've got to keep emotions out of it, to our American friends, what's happening in New York City with Mr. Mondami, an avowed extreme left-wing socialist, saying he's going to take over many businesses in New York. He's going to take over many grocery stores. He's going to not allow people who own apartments to raise the rents. There's going to be a control of distribution. This is called, whenever you have a government saying we're going to take over control of distribution and manufacture and the production of goods, that is called pure socialism. So it could be a grand experiment about to come before our eyes. But again, a lot of the discussion is emotion and people shouting at each other and calling each other the most wretched names. Can we just take a look at history? Make your arguments. I encourage people, whether you're in New York City or whether you're here in Canada, make the arguments based on history, on which policies actually produce the most flourishing and which produce the most benefit to citizens and to be able to charter their own course and as they move ahead. Interesting to see Bill Gates coming out now and saying, you know what, folks, climate change is maybe not as extreme as we thought, and it maybe is not going to determine the demise of planet Earth. So another a voice that's been a real promoter of climate change, and I know he is still concerned about it, but he's saying let's back away from the panic narrative on this. It's not quite like that. And it's that we kind of close out on the cultural thoughts today. People generally The anxiety level among our populations, Canada, US, probably Europe, the anxiety level is increasing to the place now where one recent survey showed that a clear majority, especially among the female population, but males too, combined, a clear majority of people who are regularly on anti-anxiety medications. And some of that is caused by all the terror that's being preached about climate, but there's a lot of other issues. And it just manifests everywhere. If you're familiar with Sophia James, a very well-known musician and singer, her most recent song, So Unfair, it's called So Unfair, and it kind of characterizes how people are reacting today when they get hit with something they don't like. They just say it's unfair. They feel like they don't have any personal agency, that they can't do anything about it, which is not true. You can control things that are within your own life and your own network. However, she's now produced, you talk about one group against another. She's produced a test that you can take. I'm not recommending people do it, but it's dividing everybody into 7 groups. So you look at her little chart and you see which group you go into, and you say, yeah, I'm a group 4, I'm a group 5. Her group 7 seems to be the one where you get the prevailing concerns. And so much of it comes down to anxiety that now we have many of these singers that are actually, in a way, glorifying which anxiety, which depressant they're on. You hear phrases like Prozac Nation. You hear talk about going to your Lexpro and whatever your favorite drug of choice is. Not a good sign overall that you have, especially, let's say, the 13 to 30-year-olds. And I forget, it's hard to define. Is that Gen Z? What gen is that? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta? It doesn't matter. But especially that age group are really overwhelmed with anxiety and so fixed on these anxiety drugs. Let's reach out to one another a little more. Let's recognize we have differences of opinion. Let's be prepared to discuss those with vigor, but let's back off the anxiety quotient. And especially for those people, if you call yourself a person of faith, or even if you don't, the wisest man that ever walked the face of the earth, Jesus Christ, said, cast your anxieties on me, folks. Trust me. Pray about these things. Let's think about that today. Look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Thanks for joining in. Bye now.